I'm thrilled to be joined again on Bad Faith Podcast by Kshama Sawant. You know her, you love her. She's the one that has broadly popularized, I think, socialist alternative among so many of you. It's been so heartened to hear how many of you have reached out and looked into joining the organization, going to events, and really see it as one of the most robust, most constructive kind of organizing groups in America today, especially after we have suffered a number of disappointments, which we will get into in this episode. So welcome back, Kshama.
Thank you so much for having me back, Briahna.
So before we get into, shall we say, the failures of the progressive movement, at least the more institutionalized progressive movement, you've had some recent successes with Socialist Alternative in Seattle.
Yes, we were able to, on February 21st, make Seattle the first jurisdiction globally outside South Asia to ban caste-based discrimination. And for those of you who are not of South Asian origin, it may not be familiar to you, but caste oppression manifests itself similar to racial oppression or gender oppression. And so if you march for Black Lives Matter, then this should matter to you. And so this is an electrifying historic victory that has captured the imagination of absolutely millions across the world. In fact, my family in India was, sending me this pictures of newspapers from every conceivable language that was reporting this victory. And just actually this past Tuesday, we were able to win a huge renters' rights victory that eliminated all kinds of junk fees for renters. And now the law mandates that all late rent fees are limited to $10 a month.
That's incredible. I mean, what are some of the worst examples of rent fees that you had observed or been told about as you were fighting for that?
Some of the worst were how on the first day, like you're late by one day and you immediately get slapped with $250 late fee. Isn't that just stunning?
Oh my God. I mean, I've seen like $10. Not, in my personal experience of usually just forgetting to set my auto pay up. But I've never seen anything like $250.
Yeah, it can get out of control. And then there are also situations where they pay $100 to $250 on the first day that they're late, and then for every subsequent day, the landlords will slap another $50 or $40 per day. It is completely insane, and the kind of falsified talking points the landlord industry has. You need to incentivize renters to pay rent on time, and I'm the chair of the Renters' Rights Committee in the city council, which the Democrats couldn't, I think they tried hard not to snatch that away from us, but they weren't able to because our track record, my office's track record on renters' rights is so enormous and so unprecedented that they just would have had an outcry if they had not let me chair it. But the point is, we brought many renters to the committee and also had many renters speaking in public comment. We had a public petition that we had organized where hundreds of renters wrote to us, and they said, all of them said, look, this is completely absurd. This is just rubbish, because what more incentive do renters need to pay rent than the fact that if they don't pay their rent, they're going to be evicted?
Right.
Come on. Your credit scores are affected. Your rental record is affected. Which renter would pay late by choice only to eventually have to pay rent anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. I watched you giving a speech, I'm not sure where, and within the last few days about this issue, and speaking to the fact that there are these on the West Coast in cities like Seattle, overwhelming Democratic majorities. And yet there is still pushback and difficulty getting common sense bills like this to pass. To what do you attribute your success for folks who are around the country and perhaps on a federal level, looking at a world that we just came out of, now a year ago, where we previously did have majorities in the House, Congress, and the Democrat in the White House. And yet there still was this persistent belief or persistent acquiescence to the idea that without a super, super majority, you still can't get anything done. You are experiencing kind of major majorities and still seeing pushback on common sense ideas like this. How do you circumvent that?
Yeah, actually, just to look at some numbers and in terms of what majorities the Democrats have in Seattle and Washington state. Of course, as we've talked about before on your show, Briahna, there are 8 Democrats on the city council, and I am one socialist, and yet it's an all-out fight. And just to give you a sense also of how it is at the Washington state legislature level, what we have is Democrats, as of January of this year, Democrats control both houses of the Washington state legislature. They hold a 58-40 majority in the House and 29-20 majority in the Senate. And yet, all this year, they have been unable and unwilling to stand up for renters. And even, just to give you a sense, even a corporate loophole-filled bill for renters, which would have been very, really insipid, but it would have been something better than nothing. Even that they failed to get passed because ultimately they lack any willingness or ability to stand up for ordinary people. They're so beholden to the powers that be. And, this is something to clarify also, because it's not that, and this is very evident in the Seattle City Council, to really clarify an important thing, because obviously the Democrats, and not to mention the Republicans, who are openly bankrolled by corporate interests, they are, of course, going to do the bidding of the corporate landlords. There's no question about that. But it is not just as cut and dried as that. There are so many progressive, self-described progressive Democrats who don't actually take money from corporate landlords. If you look at their funding, it's not that impeachable. But the point is that politically speaking, they are going to refuse to do anything meaningful for ordinary people, for working people or renters, unless and until there's a real political price for them to pay. So in other words, in answer to your question, how did we win all these things? We would not have won had we not had a very, a fundamental guiding post throughout all our struggles, which is you have to understand who's actually on your side and who's not. If you have illusions in the wrong people, that's like you've ended your struggle right there. And then once having understood that, then you have to understand that there is no alternative but to present, so if you have progressive Democrats who say they're progressive in name, but then are every time going to bend to the interests of landlords or big business, then how do you force them to concede? You don't win by moralistic arguments, because they have a very careerist position on this. So the way you force them to concede, and this language also I'm using very intentionally, I am not talking about winning over Democrats. I don't expect to win their hearts and minds. What I want is to force them to vote yes. And the way you do that is not by making moralistic arguments, but by building a momentum on the ground in such a way that they get the message that, oh, you think that you are beholden to corporate landlords? Well, we're here to tell you that we are going to hold you accountable. And if you fail us on this one, if you vote no on this, or if you try to water this down, then we are going to expose you. Or right now, you are being exposed as somebody who's progressive in name only, and you don't have the right to wear the progressive mantle. I mean, just a concrete example, in the late fee battle, when we got the legislation first voted through committee, which then comes to the full city council for a vote, in committee, the most conservative council members, they brought a watering down amendment, and we, obviously myself and one Democrat, voted against it. But there was a self-described labor Democrat, his name is Andrew Lewis, he voted in favor of that amendment. Now, we could have used the approach of saying, oh, please, Councilmember Lewis, can you please do the right thing? And some of the activist organizations who did fight alongside us, they had a more conciliatory approach like that. But the renters fight back that my office and Socialist Alternative are leading, we did not use that approach. We exposed him thoroughly. We said, how dare somebody who calls himself Labor Democrat, somebody who took tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign funding from unions like Unite Here, for example, which represents hotel workers and restaurant workers, some of the most precariously positioned workers, and then turns around and votes for a pro-landlord amendment? How dare he do this? So this is how we exposed him, and we forced him to eat his words and take that back, and ultimately we won the strongest version of that bill.
So help me understand what when you say you exposed him. I mean, what do you think it actually was? Did he feel like he was threatened with his electoral chances? Was it some combination of that and uh, public embarrassment? Did he just not want to have to show up at coffee shops and restaurants and city council meetings and be harangued by folks who are pointing out his hypocrisy? I mean, what do you think it was that really shifted him on that issue? Because folks are going to want to know to be able to generalize that. Because I do think there's some parallels to what you're saying here. There are the kinds of folks who write letters to the Biden administration and they ask for things politely. And then there's this other model that I think a lot of folks were hopeful you would see more from the squad, where there were the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office with which AOC started her congressional career. There is a willingness to have more adversarial kind of environmental protests that people have been talking about and frankly have been incarcerated for. That young activist was brutally murdered in Cop City for that sort of level of protest. But the connection that you have between your actions and actual tangible results are relatively unique in the sphere that we're in right now. So what do you think it actually was that made the difference?
In fact, Briahna, it was all of the things you mentioned, the creating a political environment where the truth is brought out so fully in such a full form that it does create a situation of embarrassment for them. So just a concrete thing that I'll mention in terms of how we achieve these types of things, victories, is like you said, the sort of the liberal logic is, oh, we'll send letters to Biden or Congress or whatever. There's nothing wrong in sending letters, but it's a question of what is the political approach you do it. So one of the things we did do, and we've done consistently throughout all the victories we won, is we send mass emails from my office to many of the constituents in our city. Many of them are renters, but not all of them. Some of them are homeowners or even actually progressive landlords. I had a progressive landlord at my committee table actually who's strongly supporting this bill. But in the email, what we see, there's a difference. Like if we sent an email, a mass email saying, hey, we need your help. We need your help to convince Democrats like Andrew Lewis, or even not even calling him as a Democrat, but saying we need your help to convince all my colleagues, whatever, that they need to vote the right way, and please send this email saying, please, council members, do the right thing. That's not how we do it. What we say is, look how shameful it is. This guy calls himself a Labor Democrat, and look at what he just did. And also we provide the context for it. And one of the reasons we are able to speak with such confidence and authority about our fighting strategy is that, for example, in this context of the late fees, is that we had a whole committee that presented, renters, landlords, and renters' rights activists, including the people who provide, legal support for people facing eviction. So these are legal experts who know that this is simply not working out for renters. We presented overwhelming statistical evidence and anecdotal evidence that was just like, if you had a modicum of honesty, you would say, wow, that was a slam dunk case in favor of a $10 limit on late fees. Slam dunk demonstration of the facts of how landlords are making profits. Even during the eviction moratorium, by the way, Bri, you know this, they may increase their profits. So during the eviction moratorium, officially, there was no late fee law in Seattle. So, technically speaking, renters could have just paid their rent late or not paid, and it was still lawful because, there was a moratorium. And yet, the vast majority of renters paid their rent on time. So see, that's our evidence that, look, this is happening. 2 other cities near Seattle have already passed a $10 law and renters are paying on time. There is no difference. So we said, look, this is overwhelming statistical evidence. So that's the way we approached it. And then in our email, we said, look at the video from the committee meeting. Our side, renters, presented overwhelming evidence, and the people who watered this down, the politicians, they presented exactly zero evidence for their amendment, and yet Councilmember Lewis voted for this. Why is that? This is because, and then we have our analysis of, this is because Democrats at the end of the day are beholden to these moneyed interests. And if you're a renter and you're struggling and you want to vote on this, want to win on this, then you need to send this email, you need to come up for public comment, you need to speak up and all of that. And so that's how we brought renters out.
It sounds like you are kind of limiting the bad actor's ability to have any plausible deniability that there is an excuse for their actions other than kind of rank corruption and self-interest. And I think there are times when I think the part of the left that is very aligned with that approach will take that approach and have much more kind of strong adversarial language and talk about the interests that are driving decision making and try to squeeze the window of so many politicians who are so frequently able to say, well, I had to do this because of Manchin and Sinema, or I had to do this because of we need to be bipartisan, or I had to do this because of parliamentarian. There are all of these excuses. And I do think that you're so right that squeezing the realm of excuse making that politicians can make and forcing them to kind of sit in their corruption does have an effect on their ultimate behavior, which is why you see so many people who are described as carrying water for the Democratic Party or carrying water for establishment politics being called out for doing exactly that, for obscuring, for confusing the issue enough so that the bad actors can continue to act in the way that they have done for so long.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I was just going to say that point that you made, sorry to interrupt you, but the question of obscuring, that's a key component of what the fundamental difference is between the way we approach politics as socialist alternative and what the Democrats do, and especially the progressive Democrats, is that even when the Democrats even those Democrats who actually vote the correct way, what they don't agree with us about is exposing the bad actors. So just to give you an example, in 2018, I might have mentioned this on your show. In 2018, our first iteration of tax Amazon movement won an Amazon tax that was repealed less than a month after the vote was won, actually. And the Democrats colluded behind the scenes with Amazon executives, and they managed to repeal the Amazon tax. I mean, I've been on the council for almost 10 years. There are many shameful moments of the Democrats that I can talk about, but that was probably the pinnacle of shame or whatever acme's in it, whichever way you want to think about it, of shame at that time that the Democrats voted to repeal the Amazon tax. And then, of course, in 2020, we re-won it in the midst of the George Floyd protests. But at that time, there was one Democrat, Teresa Mosqueda. She also calls herself a labor Democrat. And then later on, last year, she led the way in repealing the pandemic hazard pay that grocery workers had won. That's another story, which, if we have time, we can talk about, because there are developments on that front as well, because the rank and file are speaking up again. But the point is, at that time, on that day, when the Democrats voted to repeal the Amazon tax that was meant to fund affordable housing, I voted no on the repeal, and Teresa Mosqueda voted no on the repeal. But if you watch the two speeches, it is night and day difference. So my speech makes it crystal clear, not surprisingly, which way I'm about to vote. Because these speeches are made before the vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you would be in no doubt whatsoever that, okay, Kshama Sawant is going to vote no on this repeal. But if you listen to Teresa Mosqueda's speech, you might be forgiven for being at the very least confused and at the most actually misled that maybe this person is going to vote yes for the repeal, because her whole speech was not about how rotten this is, that in a city where homelessness and rent skyrocketing has become just an unbelievable problem, that you are seeing these politicians kiss up to billionaires like Jeff Bezos. I mean, the anger at that time from working people was so huge that there was not even any worry about political career or whatever. You could have boldly spoken up in favor of working people at that moment. But even at that moment, you saw this Democrat, and she was going to vote no, but her whole speech was giving cover to the Democrats who were voting for the repeal. This is a fundamental difference, and this goes to the heart of what is the problem here. This is very much in line with AOC saying, there is relational harm. That was a rare moment of honesty for her, where she actually came out and said, this is what happens. What she meant was that if you're an elected official and you speak the way I speak, then you're not going to have friends in the halls of power. But so that's a question. If that's your quest, then case closed. You're not going to be a fighter for working people. You are going to be a sellout. I don't care what your intentions are. You're going to be a sellout. But yeah.
I'm so glad you go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and if you want to be a fighter for working people, then you're not going to have friends in the halls of power. You just have to accept that literally they will insult you, they will demean you, in the behind the scenes, and sometimes even in public. But it should be like water off a duck's back, because this is not about you. You are there to fight for and alongside working people. But I think this discussion, unfortunately, Briahna, we won't be able to clarify without also adding another very fundamentally important component, is that you can't do this on an individual basis. You need a party of your own.
So I was just about to turn both to the kind of party level, but also to the organization level. And I'm also glad you brought up AOC, because in the second half of this interview, I want to go through specifically an exchange that AOC recently had with David Sirota earlier this month, in which so many of the themes that we've talked about so far emerge. And we can kind of, at a more granular and specific level, paint some contrast between how even arguably the best elected progressives that we have right now are kind of failing to meet the standards that you've been laying out. But I feel like I haven't done my job here on this podcast, because someone in the progressive media community who I really love a lot asked me recently, oh, what's Workers Strike Back? And I said, oh, gosh, I haven't been pulling my weight if there are people who are so close to me still asking this question. So, you mentioned that having people power, I was going to say human resources, but it sounds like I'm working for a corporation.
Yeah.
But, having people power on the ground was so instrumental to what you've been able to accomplish in Seattle. So for those who don't know, can you just explain what Workers Strike Back is, what you hope to accomplish? And then also we can move into this conversation about, at the party level, what your views are about third parties, how to develop them, how to support them, and what people should think about this now more robust Democratic primary that's ongoing in the background.
Right. That's all, very relevant actually to why Workers Strike Back in the first place. And some of your viewers might know already, we have won 4 elections right now, by now in Seattle City Hall, and, including the recall attempt that we defeated in 2021. And we feel at this point, when I say we, I mean Socialist Alternative and we believe that we have really thoroughly demonstrated on the Seattle level how to put a fighting strategy and a sound class analysis, and also the need, how to put all of that into action. And also the other thing we've demonstrated is exactly what you were just talking about, is the need for a new party for working people, sort of demonstrating that we would not have been able to achieve what we have achieved in Seattle so far, including winning the elections, had we not had Socialist Alternative as the political backbone of all the struggle that we have conducted, which just has had such, as you said, a rare example of success for working people. And so we believe that at this point, rather than running for re-election again this year is the re-election year for the city council, for most of the city council seats, we want to take this message of this fighting strategy and the need for a militant type of organizing among working people, whether unionized or non-unionized. It applies to both. It applies to social struggles and social movements as well. But we want to take this analysis and message nationally. And that's why, rather than running for re-election one more time, we're going to be leaving this office in December undefeated, despite the best attempts of corporate landlords, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, millions, and the Democratic establishment. Despite all of that, we're going to be leaving this office undefeated. And we've recently launched a nationwide movement called Workers Strike Back. And this movement is meant to, for activists, you don't have to be a socialist or a member of Socialist Alternative to volunteer with and organize alongside Workers Strike Back. But the whole point is for us to help and bring workers together, as I said, unionized or non, it doesn't matter, on the pressing issues of the day. And one of the realities that is compelling for us in launching Workers Strike Back is the fact that what's missing is not a desire among the masses to fight back. I mean, we've seen how much anger there is, how much anger there was on the Dobbs ruling. There is so much anger on the selling out of the railroad workers, UPS workers. I mean, if you talk to rank and file UPS workers, they'll say, yeah, hell yeah, I want a good contract and I'm ready to go on strike for that. So there is obviously a rank and file a search for genuine ideas, and there's a real uprising happening among working people. But what's missing? So what's missing is not that there isn't enough leftward moving consciousness or a desire to fight back. What's missing is the examples of leadership. That's what's missing, and that's where Workers Strike Back comes in. Because for example, we've seen, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, the betrayals of the so-called squad and the Democratic Party generally. But we're also seeing a similar failure among much of the union leadership, which unfortunately embraces what we would call business unionism, which is the whole idea that rather than organizing working people, putting forward clear and concrete demands, and then being prepared to fight, and including going on strike to win them, instead business unionists think it's all about making nice with management, really having a collaborationist type of approach, and trying to use moral persuasion at the bargaining table. And in fact, just a fundamental misunderstanding that your power lies at the bargaining table. No, it does not. The workers' power lies on the street, at the picket line, by going on strike, and by seriously preparing to go on strike, by holding protest actions, by assiduously building community solidarity so that the whole community stands with every strike, where we are really explaining the truth behind the slogan of an injury to one is an injury to all. So why should the entire community support when the teachers go on strike, or nurses go on strike, or UPS workers go on strike? Why is it something at stake for all of us? So those are the ideas that we want to counter the business unionist ideas. And the Workers Strike Back itself, as a nationwide movement, is putting forward clear demands. So we all know that workers need a real raise, especially in the face of the cost of living crisis, and especially in big cities. So we are calling for at least a minimum of $25 an hour. We're calling for good union jobs for all, that we need to fight racism, sexism, and all oppression, and that we need quality, affordable housing and free healthcare for all. And in addition to all of this, Workers Strike Back, for all the reasons we just talked about, Briahna, we're also declaring that we're not going to stand for any more sellouts, and that we need a new party.
For people who might be thinking, well, I was a member of DSA, I joined after 2018, and I was so inspired, and I don't know about these kinds of organizations. What's going to be different about this one? What would you say to them?
I think fundamentally just that the inception of Workers Strike Back is on the basis of the kind of fighting strategy that we have demonstrated as so successful in Seattle. That itself is in many ways the antithesis of some of the approach that has unfortunately been used by many of the DSA leadership. I mean, I won't say all of them, because DSA is sort of a big tent organization, as we've talked about before. And I think there are some genuine people there who want to do something meaningful, but unfortunately, I think the most prominent sections of the DSA leadership have failed. They have given cover. It's what I call a pipeline of cover. The DSA leaders give cover to AOC and the squad, and then they in turn give cover to the Biden administration, who ultimately is the power behind the scenes. In terms of batting for Wall Street, and so we have a completely different approach than that, fundamentally different approach than that. And if you look at socialist alternatives' own approach towards politics, we have not engaged in that kind of cover giving politics. And inside our organization, we have a completely different kind of accountability that, in fact, the kind of accountability that is missing inside the Democratic Party, obviously, but even inside the DSA, unfortunately, like, we should have, DSA rank and file should have been able to hold those leaders accountable inside DSA who have failed to in turn hold AOC accountable or giving her and Jamal Bowman cover, so all of this.
So, I mean, why do you think that they have done so? I mean, do you think it's as simple as, one argument says, the DSA got so much more kind of clout and visibility and more membership because of their association with AOC and some of the other squad members. And as a consequence, they didn't really have power. Their power flowed from the prominence of those figures. And so at a certain point, if the DSA were to say, you are no longer in the DSA, you can no longer describe yourself as a democratic socialist, we're kicking you out because of any number of votes and moves that they've made. I think there was the fracas over Jamal Bowman was over his vote for the Iron Dome, wasn't it? Some Israel related. Okay, so and so, what do you make of that argument versus do you think it's not even that conscious, that they actually don't really have much of a disagreement, at least on the leadership level, with how the squad members are behaving, and that there's a kind of mutually beneficial détente between the electeds and the org? I mean, what do you think is driving DSA's choice not to speak out more about the decisions that are being made by squad members?
I think not having the ability to read the individual's minds. I think I would say just in terms of what we see, what we can see is in terms of evidence, in terms of their political positions taken publicly. Mm-hmm. I would say it's probably a mix because again, it's not like they all have an agreed upon position. Some of the leaders stand differently on different issues. So I think you see all of these flavors. Some I think are unfortunately, outright in politically speaking, hand in glove with AOC. I'm not suggesting that they are actually planning out with that. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I don't have evidence for that. But politically speaking, I think they are that close to that kind of politics. But then there are others who may disagree with her and the squad, but are not willing to actually speak out. And it's not just about speaking out, It is not just about publishing an op-ed, although even that would be huge progress if they published scathing op-eds about the sellouts. But it's not only about that. That would be necessary. But in addition to that, it would also be other things, like real things, like when the Dobbs ruling was leaked, it's not only that the Democratic Party, including AOC, by the way, let's not forget, they did nothing to organize anything. Like, was there any call from them saying, hey, on this day and at this time, let's march on the Capitol? Can you believe how many people would have turned out for that? Because there was such anger, right? Yeah. And with majority American support for Roe v. Wade, they could have really made something happen. But the Democratic politicians didn't. And as I said, let's not forget that AOC is part of that. The women's organization, the mass women's organizations, NARAL, Pro-Choice, and Planned Parenthood, they did nothing. But DSA also did not call for huge protests. Unfortunately, Socialist Alternative was the only organization, really, among the few organizations, but we are a small organization. We called protests. And in fact, we turned out tens of thousands of people because we had protests in multiple cities. And it was clear to us how much anger there was. And it was very clear to us that the potential was for far bigger actions. And all of this kind of leadership failed. And another leadership we should call out is labor leadership. Why didn't the labor unions, why didn't the nurses unions, teachers unions, other unions take the lead? Why didn't Liz Schul, of the AFL-CIO, why didn't she take the lead on calling out protests against the Dobbs ruling? Why didn't we see any of this happen? So it's not only one person or one institution. It's you can see these are widespread failures because of the approach that they're using, where they're refusing to. And as you said, I agree with what you said. They're refusing to take an adversarial position, And in fact, I think we can go even farther than that, right? We can say that in reality, the adversarial relationship between those who are getting screwed over and those who are doing the screwing already exists. What you guys are doing is refusing to acknowledge that there is that adversarial relationship. And then on the basis of that adversarial, you fight back because that's your only option, because they're the ones screwing you over. So what other option are you left with, right? But I just want to clarify one thing. If any DSA leader is saying that, oh, well, we depended on the squad and so we can't really call it out. No, DSA's big historic burst of growth happened in the wake of the Trump election. So as a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite of what they might be claiming, in the sense that because of the DSA, the failure of big sections of the DSA leadership to not only call out those who have betrayed us, but also their failure to mobilize for big struggles. Because of all of this, right now, what are we seeing? Actually, a decline in the DSA membership. And I can guarantee you, if any section of the DSA leadership were willing to fight in the way we are fighting in Socialist Alternative, there would be immediate, young people and working people would turn towards them.
Yeah, I really like your point about how there is an adversarial relationship that already exists, and that these figures that should be acting on that and capitalizing it are ignoring it. More insidiously, sometimes it feels as though they are actually papering it over and assuaging it and, disappearing it by talking about the possibility that working on the inside is actually going to yield results in a way that might incentivize people to settle down and just wait it out and trust the process. That being said, that is the exact argument that so many people have made as to why the left should not invest in electoralism, generally speaking, but in particular at the kind of presidential election level. And there have been ongoing debates for over a year now, well in advance of anybody announcing a candidacy, about the extent to which anyone should invest in or care about what's going on in a Democratic primary. There was a hope that some candidates might run outside the party as third parties. We haven't, people thought that Marianne Williamson might, she hasn't. There is some optimism that she or another candidate might do a dirty break. Obviously, we'd have to wait and see what happens there. But so far, people aren't especially optimistic. Now we have RFK Jr., who is in the race and who is already polling at 14%, and who has galvanized a lot of people because of his strong anti-war message and strong environmental record and message, and his strong anti-corruption message, and who are willing to overlook some other aspects of his history, namely with respect to the connection between vaccines and autism, which science does not validate, but which he has advocated for. They say, well, maybe I don't even agree with him on that, but I don't agree with Biden on a whole lot of things. And you guys forced me to vote for him last time. So what's the difference? I do agree with a lot of what he does have to say. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the field, generally speaking, and whether or not, in a Democratic primary context, there's any value in casting your vote for within the Democratic Party, and still reserving your opportunity to do other kinds of things with your vote in a general election.
I think, first of all, just to clarify, just in sort of the overarching point is, we're not against. We're not I wouldn't characterize Socialist Alternative as anti-electoralist. I mean, here I am, we've won 4 elections. So, that itself is proof. But we also don't believe that elections or electing people is where we can find the biggest or best avenues for building power for working people. So it's not, we don't think that a simplistic approach one way or another works. And I also don't believe that, and I think we've talked about this before, that there shouldn't be a left candidate for running for president. Absolutely, there should be, and really that campaign should be less about the candidate, should be more about using that as a vehicle to build some struggle that can then stand the test of time. That can build beyond the election year. That is what we need to do. So, in other words, it's not that we're against elections, but we also have to be clear that winning a seat is not going to be the end of the road, even if we did. Although on the presidential level, we're far away from it. We have to be sober, and so really we have to understand that if we're going to run a left candidate, then it's not you're not going to win. But you're not going to win the election. But what you can win is maybe laying the groundwork for something that can build in the future. So if that approach is used, then absolutely it should be done. And also running on strong demands that will unite working people on both economic issues, the issues of oppression, all of that. But the problem I have with running as a Democrat is that's been tried. Bernie Sanders, and the blunt truth is none of these candidates can hold a candle to Bernie Sanders in terms of the political strength he brought. I mean, literally calling himself a socialist and never backing down from that self-avowed title. I mean, that did a huge service for the movement because young people, were inspired by that. And for him to embrace that was important, even though I have disagreements on what his definition of socialism is versus mine. But that's different, a separate question. I appreciate that he called himself a socialist, that he called for a political revolution against the billionaire class and the concrete fighting demands that he was bringing forward. It was clear that had the potential to win a lot of white working class people over in many of these states that liberals in big cities just write off as, oh, they're just right-wing people. No, these are people who can be won over, many of them. Not all, but many of them can be won over. But the problem with that was not the demands he raised. We agreed with all of his demands. And you were obviously with Bernie Sanders at that time in 2016, but I was also Socialist Alternative and I were campaigning for him. I spoke at his big rallies in Washington State, both in 2016 and 2020. And we campaigned for him. We called for a vote for him. But all the while, what we said came to bear, unfortunately, that the Democratic Party would never allow Bernie Sanders to become the candidate for the Democratic Party, and that he should run as an independent in the general election and then use that to launch a political organization for the working class. Had he done that, that would have been, just monumental service to the movement, but he didn't agree with that. So my point is, one, we don't have any candidate that can even hold a candle to the campaign that he ran. So what are we, what is there for us here? And then secondly, we've tried running in the Democratic Party. So what are we trying to prove again?
Let me ask you about that though, Kshama, because it seems to me that let's say, okay, no one's Bernie so far, but if hypothetically you thought there is some value to somebody, one, running to the left of Biden, either in the primary or also in the general, isn't there an advantage to someone who does want to run in a general to exploit the Democratic primary, to use the Democratic primary to get more publicity, more notoriety, potentially to have access to the debate stage, et cetera, so that they can then make a better case for why it's appropriate for them to run in a general election where of course they're going to be accused as an independent. Yes, as an independent, where of course they're going to be, described as, throwing the election to Republicans. But if they can say, for example, I got 30% of the Democratic primary vote, there were so many independents and Republicans that were locked out of the primary elections. I really do think because of closed primaries, I really do think that I have a lot of American people behind me, and therefore I'm going to run in a general election. Is that a better position for a candidate to be in than emerging relatively unknown potentially and without having the record of having run or the platform of having run within the Democratic Party in a general election?
But this here's the problem though, Briahna. I mean, this is what you described is exactly what we were suggesting Bernie should do.
Right.
That, we didn't agree. I want to be clear. We didn't agree with him running as a Democrat in the first place. But what we said was, having run as a Democrat in the primary, we can guarantee you, we can predict the future. We don't have a crystal ball, but we can tell you what's going to happen. They will sooner let the most horrendous right-wing person become president than allow a working class agenda to succeed in their party. That because they are a party of billionaires.
Right. And Bernie wasn't willing to do that.
And that's totally different. But the example that you laid out, my point is that is exactly what we said for Bernie. So that, at the very least, he should run as independent once he's thrown out of the primaries. He didn't do that. So it's no, but like that's what I'm trying to say. If but this is my problem. If someone else were to emerge who was going to do that, obviously we would make the points that we have made for Bernie. And if that some hypothetical person was willing to then run as an independent, a strong campaign as an independent, and then use that as a launching pad to inaugurate an organization that can actually serve working people in the years coming, then yes. But the thing is, Briahna, we can only base ourselves on what is, not what could be. If that were to happen, yes, then come and ask me that question. No, I want to say that if that were to happen, then come and ask me, Kshama, what do you think? And then I will tell you, yes, this is we don't agree about this or this, but it's good that he is running or she is running, or whoever they are running, and then they should run independent. But right now there isn't, and so I can't be in the business of saying hypothetically it can happen, and so it should.
But Kshama, it didn't happen with Bernie either. But they're what you still, as you said, campaigned for him and rallied with him and knocked doors for him and all these other kinds of things. And by your own description, you went to Bernie, you wanted him to do that, you advocated that he did that, you pressured him to do that, and he still didn't do it. And yet, even after he didn't do it in 2016, Bernie still has socialist alternative support in 2020. And so I appreciate that there might be a willingness to go out on a limb for Bernie because of what his identity as a socialist does for the movement.
It wasn't about his identity as a socialist. It was about what he was willing to fight for concretely.
That's fine. So his platform and all of those things. But the point...
It also wasn't just about him, though. It's his campaign electrified tens of millions of Americans. That's what's important, because we want to bring those people into struggle. That was our main goal. It wasn't about
I totally get that. But my point is this. It's, someone like RFK Jr., who I'll confess is not my candidate, right? In terms of, I don't know that person as much. I would have to listen to a lot more of what he had to say. I'm certainly not in any position to cast my lot, behind him with him. But I can observe that there seems to be a great deal of energy immediately behind his campaign. His polling already has spiked to levels that many other hopefuls would be very envious of, even before he announced his campaign officially. Reporting from both Dave Weigel, who was on Rising last week, and also Sabby Sabs, who was there in attendance. Both Dave and Sabby were in attendance at his rally. Apparently, it was a large room that was filled to the brink and also had overflow rooms. There seems to be an organic appetite for it. He has an incredible amount of crossover appeal to independent and even Republican voters. He has a strong anti-war message, which seems to be something that's very much galvanizing in the political world right now, in which Democrats have completely dropped the ball on. The only people who are really talking that way in Congress are, folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who nobody should listen to at any point.
We are starving American people, and we are cutting them off from the kind of aid that we should be giving, that we're instead spending on being the policemen of the world. We have 800 bases around the world now. We spend $880 billion a year on our military. We were supposed to get a peace dividend. After the Soviet Union collapsed, we were supposed to go from 6 billion to 2 billion. That was a peace dividend. And then we were going to spend the rest, bring it home and build schools and infrastructure. Instead, we've made up a bunch of foreign enemies and different enemies and things that we got to do to spend more money. The military-industrial complex and the intelligence agencies are telling us instead of dropping it to 2, we raised it to 8.8.
So, it seems to me a little bit like a chicken and an egg situation, where if you went to Bernie and said, could you please, would you consider doing a dirty break? Would you consider running as an independent? Are you thinking at all about the possibility of bringing that question to someone like RFK Jr. or Marianne, whoever else might enter into the race? And if they were to do that and did have some energy behind them, is there something about those candidates that you think makes them fundamentally not someone you would want to kind of partner with in that way? Or do you see that as a real possibility?
First of all, I would say the onus is not on us as working people to provide support for them and then try to glean out maybe there is something worth supporting. It's on them. If they're going to run as alternatives to Biden, then the onus is on them to show why they are fighting for, how they are fighting for working people, or that we should see them as fighters for working people. I think, Briahna, the bar has to be very high. It can't be based on the feeling of desperation that I know a lot of people are feeling, that we don't want Biden, we need an alternative. Okay, so let's maybe Marianne it is, maybe RFK Jr. I don't think that approach works. I mean, maybe you won't agree with me, but this is what I said when we talked about Marianne Williamson too, the last time I was on the show, that it's not. I mean, I would be only too happy to be proven wrong, that, oh, maybe one of these candidates is actually going to be a fighter for working class, but I don't see it happening. Honestly, RFK Jr., I don't care what he says. He's an insider. He's a political insider. What if AOC?
Kshama, so was Bernie. I mean,
no. Bernie was not an insider in the way that RFK is. It's simply not true.
But Kshama, Bernie was in Congress for like 40 years. I mean, this is not a criticism. I love Bernie, but
but here's the deal, though. We supported Bernie in that campaign because it was clear that at that time it was going to really catch the country by storm. And as I said, the tens of millions of people were going to be really energized by his call for taxing Wall Street and ending student debt and Medicare for all. It was about those things, and in his willingness to actually stick to the message and campaign. I mean, do you remember how many people mocked him for giving the same speech everywhere? That is exactly what he should have done. And my point is that if you are going to support a candidate that is running in the Democratic Party, your bar has to be very high. So I don't agree with you. No, neither of these candidates are rising to that level. And if they want to, they can. Nobody's stopping them. So because it's not a personal thing. It's about what we owe working people. And what I owe working people right now is to not fuel any illusions whatsoever in either of these candidates. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is.
I guess I'm struggling with the idea that I understand an argument that the bar should be set somewhere. I'm struggling with this idea.
It should be set very high, not somewhere, but very high.
Well, the second part of what I'm going to say is going to clarify why I say somewhere. My concern is that the height that is considered very high is basically just the fact of Bernie having existed means that everyone is going to compare every candidate to Bernie. And it's less that there is an actual metric that's being decided on the basis of what the returns for the left and for working people can actually be by getting behind a candidate. It's more, well, they were less than Bernie. Therefore, no matter what gains could come out of this represents a step back. And it's not entirely clear to me. And I could be argued, I could be convinced, but it's not entirely clear to me that the fact of a candidate being worse than Bernie means there still aren't real, tangible, valuable gains that could be had for the left and for working people by using their candidacy to advance various policies that are identical to Bernie's policies, to advance a kind of a political reckoning. So many people, despite their disappointments in Bernie now, were radicalized because of their work on the 2016 or 2020 campaigns. Nick from RBN talks about how radicalized he was by working on the Bernie campaign, despite his ongoing disappointments with the, kind of elected progressive community right now. And so I guess that is my issue. I completely concede, and no planet do I think that either Marianne Williamson or RFK Jr. are as good candidates as Bernie for myriad reasons. But I do, especially behind RFK right now, and it's early days, of course, but behind RFK Jr. right now, there does seem to be a familiar sense of energy. And two, given when you look at their platforms, and if you say, well, it's about saying to America that, we still can't have Medicare for all, we still can't have a $15 or $25 minimum wage, we still should be fighting for student debt cancellation. RFK has been but has been tweeting about his desire to use executive orders on Biden's failures to do so. Both candidates have had a very adversarial, aggressive message when it comes to the swamp and corruption in Washington, D.C. And it seems to me that all of that, from a messaging perspective and from a policy perspective, is potentially beneficial. But what I'm hearing from you, Kshama, it feels like you sense that there might be some downside, some damage that is done either to the left or to socialist alternative or to working people by even kind of rhetorically supporting the value of these people running or of these campaigns or of there being a candidate against Biden. Is that right? I mean, that's kind of what I'm sensing, because it seems, from my perspective, it's like, hey, live and let live. They're running. I'm not running them. I'm not paying for it. But if they want to run and do this, and I obviously have some residual value for it, why not be supportive? Why not vote for them? Why not attend their rallies? Why not retweet their stuff? It's hard for me to see the downside. So
because I'm not just some ordinary person who can just vote. I mean, I'm not. I would never blame ordinary people for voting for whoever they thought was the best option that they had in a universe of really no options. Mm-hmm. So, if you look at the way we approached the election around Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, we never faulted ordinary people for voting for Hillary Clinton. Our starting point was always, we understand, in the face of the threat of the right wing, it feels compelling, but here's why we think it doesn't help to vote for Hillary Clinton, because it's that kind of politics that has created the space for a monster like Donald Trump in the first place. So we have to have a break from that at some point or another. And the more we delay that kind of break, the more this vicious cycle of Democrats betraying, people feeling disenchanted, and then unfortunately maybe being attracted to the right wing. So that process, we were pointing out that process, but that is never about blaming ordinary people for voting a certain way.
I understand.
Can I respond? And also, we in fact, there were lots of ordinary people who voted for Trump that in the primaries had voted for Biden. We also pointed that out. Democratic politicians will never tell you this, but in reality, that is what happened. A lot of people who voted for Bernie were completely disenchanted, and they already knew they hated Hillary Clinton, not because she was a woman. Maybe there was some of that, but in reality, the vast majority of them were angry at her for being a corporate stooge. And that's why they didn't want to vote for her. Some of them just stayed out of the race. Some of them voted for Trump. All of that process was unfolding. But just to clarify on the other point that you raised, that, well, are we going to say that just because somebody is not Bernie, then we are just going to reject them and maybe they're bringing some value? No, I think we have to be clear, or maybe they bring something of value for working people. That's where I think I just want to clarify that when I mention Bernie, I don't mean that Bernie is the standard and then you have to get up to his standard. In some ways, it's the other way around, in the sense that I would say that if we want to stay true to working people and not create illusions in people who are going to sell working people out, then you have to have Bernie as the floor. There's a ceiling and a floor. Bernie is not the ceiling, he's the floor. Like if these candidates are not even Bernie Sanders, then I don't believe that they are going to serve any purpose. In fact, it'll actually be problematic, because if we start creating illusions in them, so there's a difference between an ordinary person voting for some candidate who's going to sell them out because they feel like they're out of options. But it's quite another for me to publicly create illusions in those candidates who I know are going to sell out. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a difference between those two things. And so I cannot. So when you say, can you not rhetorically support them? No, I cannot rhetorically support them, because it's not rhetorical. It's about actually, am I presenting the truth as I know it to the working class, or am I creating illusions in things that I know are illusion creating? So that's different than tomorrow, if one of these two candidates was to actually become a fighter for the working class. I don't expect this, but if they were going to, then I would happily say, wow, I was wrong. People should vote for this candidate and we should campaign for them, and let's see if we can build a new party out of this. So
what does that look like? What would it look like?
We're not above doing that. But we also at every moment I have to say what I say publicly has to be in accordance with what I actually believe, not what I wish would happen. There's a difference between
Right,
two
but
things.
Kshama, I think that's not what I'm saying.
In terms of what you said, why can't we be live and let live? Yeah, I'm not preventing Marianne Williamson from running, but if you're asking me what I think about her, I'm going to tell you what I think about her. But she's free to run. But do I think it's in the interest of working people? No, I don't.
Well, I think that's not quite what I'm saying. It seems to me, and my position has been, that it's not necessarily be creating a false illusion by saying strategically, it's better for a candidate who is going to be in a general election to be able to claim, be able to point to how much support they got in a primary. And so strategically, even if I'm a Green Party voter and have been for the last 2 cycles and plan to vote Green Party in all likelihood in the next political cycle, that strategically as a voter, it makes sense for me to vote for the most left candidate in the Democratic primary and or the candidate that is most likely to do a dirty break, because I have my own political goals. I don't think that is me promoting any illusion about either of those candidates being as strong candidates as Bernie Sanders or having agendas as good as Bernie Sanders or anything like that. Or that even if they were literally Bernie Sanders, that even Bernie Sanders could bring on the revolution just because of his being elected. And there are people who would argue, given Bernie Sanders' failures, I mean, do you even regret getting behind him in the last 2 cycles? Because, of course, Bernie Sanders wasn't going to bring on the revolution.
No,
one person alone couldn't do all of that.
We don't regret, because we never see. That's the thing. It's a question of if we as socialist alternative at any point lied to the working class or created illusions in anything. See, that's the thing.
But that's exactly my point, though, Kshama. Kshama, I want to land this one, actually. I have to finish this point. If you understood that Bernie wasn't a savior, but you were willing to get behind him because there were certain advantages, and you were very clear that we're behind him in this limited way, why can't that be also true for other candidates, even if they're worse than Bernie Sanders on paper?
Because you have to, because it's where do you draw the lowest common denominator?
Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, so you want to talk about Marianne Williamson? You show me where she has ever actually criticized Biden. You show me where she has taken an actual anti-war position. She has not.
She hasn't. That's why I brought up JFK Jr., Kshama.
But that's my question. How low of a
I think that's completely fair. I think that's completely fair, but that's specifically why I brought up JFK Jr. in this conversation. I think those criticisms of Marianne are fair, and I've said that consistently throughout. Me personally, I still think it would be worth if she were the only one in the primary, or if for policy reasons you prefer her to JFK Jr. I still think it's worth voting for her in a primary. But I think those criticisms are completely fair. JFK Jr., 1, does seem to have genuine energy forming behind him. 2, has been taking very strong anti-war positions throughout his entire life and up until now in this Ukraine war. Has very strong statements about it on his website, made many strong statements about it in his opening speeches and interviews on Tucker Carlson and all of that.
Particularly the issues of war. And, my son went over and fought in the Ukraine. As I said today, I think people, the major doyens, sort of diplomatic, the most respected diplomatic gurus like Henry Kissinger and Jack Matlock and Larry Wilkinson have all said the Ukraine war is a huge problem for our country because from a geopolitical standpoint, it's driving the Russians close to the Chinese, which is the worst thing for us. But we're there for the right reasons because we have tremendous compassion for the Ukrainian people and the illegal invasion, the brutality, and also their valor and their courage. My own son was serving over there. He joined a special forces unit as a machine gunner. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive. Americans care about the underdog. They care about that kind of suffering. But the question is, why are we in the Ukraine? Because Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, said that we're there to exhaust the Russians. President Biden has said that we're there to deplatform, to depose Vladimir Putin. And if that's why we're there, and we're killing a lot of Ukrainians as pawns in a proxy war between 2 great powers. Here's one last thing I would say. Nobody talks about this. There's 14,000 Ukrainian civilians who have died, but 300,000 troops. The Russians are killing Ukrainians at a a 7-to-1 to 8-to-1 ratio. They cannot sustain this. What we're being told about this war is just not true.
No, it's not true. And I would hope, despite the fact you criticize their advertisers, other media outlets would have enough respect for our country and for its voters to give what you said a hearing, because I think it's really important. And we're, again, grateful that you came on our show tonight. You're always welcome. Bobby Kennedy Jr., thank you.
And two, has a very strong record on any number of very important issues, like the fact that he's been an environmental lawyer for the last 30, 40 years or whatever it's been. So I get all of the reasons why the bar is definitely lowered by both of those candidates in different ways. But to me, if you're able to create that, the bar was too low, arguably, for Bernie too. So if you're able to make the space to say, I'm supporting Bernie conditionally because I think we can get this X, Y, and Z out of it. He advantages the movement in these ways. Unless, from my perspective, and I don't need you to agree with this, but from my perspective, if a person can also advantage the movement in X, Y, and Z ways, and you can also be very clear with your messaging that people shouldn't overinvest in the person for the reasons that you've articulated, then it's still worth it to try to get as much of that advantage out of them as possible. That's just, I have a hard time seeing what the downsides are.
But that's because maybe it's a different view you're having about what it means to get the maximum out of something. So in other words, if you're asking me, would we recognize that strategically, if Biden has no competition at all,
yeah,
isn't that worse in terms of what pressure there is on the Democratic establishment? That's a different conversation. We can talk about that.
That's exactly what I'd love to. Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
I know you're getting at that, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not all wrapped up in that, though, because if you talk about, is it good or bad for the Democratic establishment to just run Biden and not really have competition? I would say, just from if we're just having an intellectual conversation about the strategic sort of back and forth for the Democratic establishment, then we could talk about how there are pros and cons as far as the Democratic establishment's interests themselves are concerned. Meaning, on the one hand, it will be better for Biden because it's awkward within the party to have some credible competition. But on the other hand, only running Biden is actually not good for them either, because the majority are saying they don't want Biden as the candidate. So as far as the Democratic establishment is concerned, it's a rock and a hard place situation. So as a matter of fact, if you take that into consideration, it should actually sow doubt in how much faith you should put in candidates like RFK Jr., who are actually pretty influential themselves, but may look like they are, sort of the alternatives to Biden. So it would be in fact naivety on our part to not see that a real insider like him, if he's running against Biden and the New York Times is talking positively about him, all of this.
Well, I don't think the New York Times is talking positively about RFK Jr.
There's always they can always create the illusion of debate, by having a certain criticism, but ultimately this is not some working class candidate who's running in any way. And Bernie was there for years, but he actually ran a campaign that threatened the Democratic Party establishment. That is why they pulled out all the stops to vanquish him. And so if a certain candidate who is running against Biden takes correct positions on some individual issues, we have no problem acknowledging and just saying that, okay, this XYZ candidate took the correct position on the war and this person didn't. It's not like we are in the business of denying reality, but what I'm trying to say is that just acknowledging the strategic ins and outs, or talking about what the positions are of the different candidates, that's one conversation. But creating illusions in them, that's quite another. Those are two separate things. It's not like we want a sledgehammerish approach about understanding what the positions are of each candidate. We're completely capable of having the nuanced understanding, but that is not the same. You can't equate that to, okay, now come out and support for them. Why can't you vote for them? No, as I said, ordinary people, if they want to vote for them, we're not going to be against ordinary people. But we can't be in the business of creating illusions. Again, this has been tried out. We have been proven right that running in the Democratic Party does not work. And furthermore, I think, in terms of the other conversation that we were hoping to have today, we saw AOC even, who, as Politico magazine recently said, from agitator to insider, the evolution of AOC. This shows you that even somebody who clearly came as a working class candidate. I mean, I saw her campaign videos. She really, there was a real hope in her that she would actually do it. And you talked about the occupation that she did alongside the Sunrise Movement of Nancy Pelosi. Like, if she had stayed with that would have been amazing. But the reason I'm using her example is that even someone like her, once she entered Congress, it was very quick, her selling out. And in fact, the second sentence in this Politico article says 4 years into her House career, she's embracing a new role, team player. Enough said.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.